Good afternoon, everyone. Okay, I'm obviously competing with cake. I've never heard transformation described as a sugar hit, but I'll do my best. So my name is Andy Parker. Just to let you know, I am just about recovered from the minor pneumonia, and that has led to three things. The first, I have deep empathy for anyone that's ever had the full pneumonia. Two, I'm going to use a handheld mic because I'm pretty sure there'll be some coughs at some point, and I don't want you to have to hear those. So just kind of bear with me on that. So I'm here to talk about dual transformation. And dual transformation is a framework or an idea that we use to help organizations sustain growth over the long term. And to start with, Anthony's also helped by introducing this gentleman already, but the organization I work for, Innosight, is a growth strategy consultancy. We are co-founded by Professor Clay Christensen of the Harvard Business School, who Anthony talked about earlier, in terms of his theory of disruption, which he wrote about in his seminal work in 1997, The Innovator's Dilemma. So we really are an institution founded by Clay to help large organizations or organizations of all sizes battle with disruption and set winning growth strategies in the long term. So, but before we get into the answer, let's talk a little bit more about disruption and this powerful force that it is. Amin shared this research. This is research that we conduct every 2 years of companies and their longevity on the S&P 500. And what you can see here is back in the 60s and 70s, companies tended to be on the S&P 500, this is the 500 biggest companies in the world, for about 30 years. If you go forward to the 1990s, that drops down to about 20 years. Clearly there are peaks and troughs throughout this, but the overall trend is downward. What we're forecasting at the moment is but in about 6 years' time, we'll be down to 14 years in terms of the average lifespan of companies on the S&P 500, which means in the next 10 years, you can expect half the companies to no longer be on the S&P 500. And of course, there are lots of reasons why companies exit. Some are just overtaken and are in a slump. Some are acquired, either by private equity or a competitor, and others go bankrupt. And there are, reasons why companies enter the S&P 500. They might be going for the next step in their evolution, in their growth story, or increasingly, as has been the theme of today, they are disruptors. And disruption, this word that is often heard and used in many different forms. Let me give you, a very simple definition of it. It is simply solving an old problem in a new way. And we've talked, I think, consistently today about the importance of focusing on problems worth solving. And the new way is technology and a different business model. And when you combine new technologies or even existing technologies with new business models, you get very powerful forces of disruption. And we talked about how incumbents are either not motivated to compete or simply can't compete because of their incumbent business model and the economics they have around that. So talking about these disruptors coming in, if you look at the top 10 in the S&P, they are today dominated by your Facebooks, your Amazons, your Googles, the companies that have come up several times today, and you can see just how much of the market capitalization they are taking in terms of the top 10. But despite this, leadership behaviors don't seem to be changing. What's on the screen here is from various surveys of senior leaders that essentially says that the majority of them, 4 out of 5, would be willing to destroy value in the name of smoothing out their short-term earnings. They have admitted to prioritizing short-term financial results over long-term investments. And they've also admitted that they are willing to decrease R&D spending to hit a short-term goal. So, why is this mindset of, I call it addiction to business as usual. It's about perpetuating today, and it's really this mindset and the forces of disruption that cause the S&P 500 longevity to fall and companies to exit. And so on that, I want to really share with you the framework or the idea that we use to advise our clients to essentially set strategy for long-term performance and growth. And it's a very simple framework, but as always, simple frameworks are very complicated to apply in the context of the organization you're advising. But firstly, so dual transformation, firstly, the clues in the name. This is not about one single monolithic change. This is about two simultaneous transformations. The first, transformation A, represented by the blue circle, is really about the reinvention of today. It's about ensuring your current business model is positioned for sustainable growth. This is not operational efficiency or incremental innovation. It's more fundamental than that. Usually you know that because the metrics, or the key metric you're measuring changes, and I'll give some examples in a minute. The second transformation is the creation of tomorrow. It's the discovery of those new growth engines, those new business models that are going to allow you to compete in different or adjacent markets in the long term in terms of creating the next version of your organization. And there is a C in the middle that completes the ABC framework here, and the C stands for the capabilities link. And this is really how we fight back against the forces of disruption, by really intelligently accessing and borrowing the assets and capabilities and hard-to-replicate skills that we've built up in our A business and using them to fight unfairly in the B business. So that's the framework. Now let's bring it to life with some examples. So at least one of these companies has come up several times today. Netflix and Amazon. The reason I picked those just to bring to life the model is because they came joint top in our global study of organizations who have driven dual transformation successfully in our 2017 ranking. I'll show you our 2019 ranking later. Is anyone in this room never used either of these companies? Okay, I saw one hand. I think these companies are so pervasive in our lives now, but let's talk about Amazon. Transformation A for them is really their story from going from an e-tailer of books to the everything store, an e-commerce giant, and they've done that through innovations such as customer reviews and Amazon Prime. So that's their transformation A. I think their most famous transformation B, and it's good that Darren's here because he can fill you in all the details that I can't share right now, but it's Amazon Web Services. You know, a completely different business that they've created in terms of cloud computing. But if you look at the origins of Amazon Web Services, it actually came out of an internal IT project. So Amazon was very frustrated at the time with its development process and development times for its core e-commerce platform, and also enabling others to integrate to that platform. And they said there's got to be a better way to do this. And they essentially broke up their tech stack into bite-sized chunks and standardized and automated as much of it as they could, and had incredible results in the core, and basically said about 3 years later, hey, we actually think this could be useful to everybody, and this is a way that other companies can operate in terms of the e-commerce and beyond that in terms of computing. And they obviously created what is now known as infrastructure as a service, and are a dominant force in cloud computing, $25 billion, majority of Amazon's profits today. So clear example, transformation A and B, using the capabilities created in A to fight unfairly in B. Netflix, another example. A for them is the transformation from DVDs by mail into a streaming business. Netflix was always from the outset going to be a streaming company, but they had to wait for broadband speeds and the cost of data to come down. So transformation A, streaming. In terms of transformation B for them, that's going into original content. So they built up this incredible asset and capability around analytics, knowing exactly what your preferences are, knowing exactly how to recommend to you what you want to watch. And they use that to commission original content, things like House of Cards or more recently Stranger Things, because they know they're going to be hits because they've got the analytics and the data to prove it. So again, borrowing assets and capabilities from A to create a B business. So that's the dual transformation framework, and that's the example of Amazon and Netflix to bring it to life. But what I want to talk to you today is really about Australia. And we took this framework and we said, who in Australia, if we take the ASX 200, has number one, meaningfully reinvented their core business, number two, meaningfully created new businesses outside the core, transformation B, and of course have driven fantastic financial results in terms of revenue growth and total shareholder returns. So, without further, no, hang on, this is the process we went through. I was just going to do the big reveal, but there's one more. We went through a sort of funnel process, had lots of hard conversations and whittled it down to 8. So there are 8 Australian transformation champions is what we're calling them. And the performance they've generated is really quite something. You can see there it says they've outperformed the ASX by 7 times in the last 5 years. To put that in context, if you had bought these 8 shares 5 years ago, you'd have a 209% return versus 32% if you just invested in the full index. So they really are not just doing this stuff, they're doing it really well and generating outsized performance and sustainable growth in the long term. So now, without further ado, here are the 8 Australian transformation champions. So firstly, we have Aristocrat, which is the casino gaming machine company, and they've moved into social and digital gaming. Next is Caltex, the refiner, distributor and marketer of petroleum, and they've really moved into the convenience retail space. Downer, which is an engineering and mining services company that's now a fully integrated services company, including things like facilities management. Aurora, which is a packaging company, and now has quite a successful business in visual communications, everything from creative all the way through to point of sale display. Next is Qantas, your beloved national carrier. Qantas has actually created, despite trying to sell it twice, an incredible business around loyalty, and I'll talk more about that in a second. REA Group, the property platform, they've moved into lifestyle services and mortgages and financial services. Seek, the employment platform, they have entered the higher education space. One of the reasons I've been to Australia 17 times this year is I've been advising one of the large universities down in Melbourne, and I've been telling them, you know, we really need to look at Seek as much as we do the other universities and what they're doing in the postgraduate space, because, you know, they're really saying that we won't only get you a job, we'll upskill you or reskill you for that job. And then finally, Webjet, which is the online travel agency, began in booking flights and now has a really successful B2B business in wholesale hotel room beds. So here are the 8 champions, and I'm just going to get some more water. What I think is really interesting, though, is you look at these companies, and there's no sort of theme in terms of industry. They're from, you know, some of them are really legacy industrial companies. Some are internet age new entrants. The oldest company on this list is 160 years old, which is Aurora. The youngest is Webjet, which is 21 years old. The biggest is $21 billion. The smallest is $800 million. Some are B2B, some are B2C. So it's a really diverse set of companies, but I think there are still lessons that we can take away from what they've done and can apply to whichever business, whatever kind of business that you happen to be a part of. So I want to go through those 5 lessons now. The first one is pretty obvious. It's the title of the talk, but it's still nevertheless true. All of these champions have been successful at dual transformation. That is to say, they have reinvented or repositioned their core business whilst discovering and creating meaningful new businesses in parallel, and doing so by accessing those unique skills, assets, and capabilities that they've created to do it. So here's Webjet, and I should have said we interviewed most of the leaders of these companies. I think 5 out of the 8, we interviewed the CEO or the managing director to really get their insights on the story. So for Webjet, it was John Gusick. And what they did is they realized in their flight booking business that they were going to face increasing competition from the likes of Expedia, really well-funded global companies. It was just going to be a margin decrease game. It was going to be commoditized. So in terms of they said we really need to find other problems to solve for customers, and they basically built ancillary services around hotels, package holidays, insurance, that sort of stuff. And that was their A transformation. But at the same time, they looked at the hotel aggregation market. So these are people who take all the empty hotel rooms in the world and aggregate them so that platforms can sell them to you and me. It's a B2B wholesale business. And they looked at it and they said, it's a fragmented industry. No one's doing it really well. We've built up some skills and some relationships that we think we can do this better. And that's exactly what they've done. In about, I think, 6 or 7 years, it's become half of their business, this web beds business. And what's really interesting and sort of brings this framework and the power of it to life is Expedia is your customer in the blue circle in transformation A. Sorry, is your competitor in A and your customer in B. And so they're actually, constantly thinking about ways to increase the services they offer in A, but also looking for meaningful new businesses that ultimately might make a competitor into a customer. So that's the first lesson. They're successful at dual transformation. The second is they all appreciate, as I'm sure does everyone in this room, the power of digital technologies, and they've been dexterous in their application. And the example here is Seek. Seek, and it's a very, in some ways, similar story to Webjet. They were looking at increased competition from people like Indeed.com, these global players, well-funded, looking, Australia in the crosshairs. What are we going to do about this? And they said, well, fundamentally, let's not be about listing a job. And that was, until that day, that was their key measure. How many jobs do we have listed on the platform? Let's not be about listing jobs. Let's be about matching candidates to the right job. And so you can see how the key metric is fundamentally changed. But when the problem to solve is to match a candidate to a job, then you need to use a lot of predictive analytics. You need to use a lot of AI and machine learning to ensure you can actually do that credibly. And I don't know how many of you ever look at the jobs that get recommended to you on LinkedIn. I occasionally look, and I'm totally baffled by the algorithms behind that. But so it's hard. So it's a problem worth solving. So all credit to them. You can see they did also automated notifications just to remind people to apply, which increased applications by 2.5 million, which tells you something about human nature. So the third lesson is that they are all adept at inorganic growth. Just to give you a flavor of that, here are lots of logos, and this is not even exhaustive. And I think this is interesting because the studies will show you that generally there are mixed results from M&A. Some people feel it can show you how value-destroying M&A can be. But what I think we take away from these 8 champions is that you can build a muscle around M&A, and if you do M&A well, it really is a key lever in any transformation story, whether it's bolstering your core business or indeed accelerating or doubling down once you have an idea in the new business transformation B. Seek, just to stay on the theme there, you can see Future Learn and Coursera, that they took, I think, nearly $200-300 million stake earlier this year in terms of their entry into higher education. So they're all using inorganic growth as a key lever and have become very good at it, adept at it, and built a muscle around it. The fourth lesson is that they structure themselves to fight back against disruption. What I mean by that is they keep their A and their B businesses separate, and they allow autonomy and entrepreneurial energy in B, but they still intelligently link it back to A in terms of making sure those assets, those brand, those custom-based, that data, whatever it is, can be accessed. And this is actually probably the hardest part of this whole process, is designing that capabilities link, because the temptation is to put it all in there, which actually can overwhelm the B. Or also it could be that we say, because we've got it in A, we should use it, which is not always the case if it doesn't create competitive advantage. But the example here is Qantas. And as I mentioned earlier, Qantas have a loyalty business, and despite some rocky moments where they've tried to sell it twice, it's now well on track to be the most profitable part of the group. Last year, it was just behind the airline in terms of profit. I think this year it will beat the airline in terms of profit. And the statistic there, 2/3 of Qantas points are now earned on the ground versus in the air. 1/3 of all credit card spend in Australia is on a Qantas-affiliated credit card. And the reason they've done that and been so successful is because they separated that business, and they said, you're not the loyalty program of an airline, you're a loyalty business. And when you say that and give that strategic direction, you're really enabling your transformation B to go out and create new B2B relationships with retailers and banks, and to do all the sort of entrepreneurial things that they need to do to build the best loyalty business that they can. So the fifth lesson is about making and funding clear choices. Basically, these 8 champions understand that strategy isn't what you say, strategy is what you do. Not only that, it's also what you choose not to do, which is a crucial part of this as well. And the example here is REA Group, so the property platform, which many of you may be users of, maybe even found the property that you live in on one of their sites. We interviewed Henry Ruiz, who's the CEO of their Asia business and the Chief Strategy Officer, and he told us, we have more ideas than we can execute. And many of the ideas that are floating through, they're actually very credible ideas. So that goes to say it's not just about choosing things to do, it's really also about what you say no to and how you create a portfolio around that, which is one of the themes we've been discussing today. So REA Group, the example here, their sort of raison d'etre is property and to create an amazing customer experience around property. And when that is sort of your strategic direction, when you look at the property ownership journey, of course, financing, as you guys know, is a huge piece of that, and mortgages. So it makes a lot of sense that they decided to acquire Smartline and partner with NAB in order to offer homeowners a loan or a mortgage. But what's interesting is, whilst that all makes sense, I was fortunate enough to be invited out to REA Group in Melbourne a couple of months ago, and the executive that was hosting me and showing me around, he actually went one step further on this story, and I'll share it with you today, but he basically said, look, we know every single home in Australia, every single one, we've got it in a database. And just like Seek, they've switched from their key metric being listing homes. They said, no, we're about matching properties to Australians. Again, replatforming that core business around predictive analytics and AI, et cetera, so that they can match the right property to you. But to do that, they have to know every Australian. And they said, we know every property, but we don't know every Australian. And so getting into financial services was allowing them to also get a much clearer data set on the Australian landlords, tenants, buyers, et cetera, in the market. So the fifth lesson is really about making these strategic choices. So to recap, the 5 lessons that we took away from this research. Number one, they've all been successful at dual transformation. That is to say, not one monolithic change. They've repositioned their core, and they've created new growth through transformation B. They have demonstrated the value of digital technologies and used them in a strategic way. They have used M&A also as a value creation lever and have built muscle around it. And they've smartly structured in terms of ensuring autonomy and separation for their different distinct businesses, ensuring A does A and B does B, but also allowing B to fight unfairly in its markets by accessing those unique, hard-to-replicate assets that they've created in the core. And finally, they understand that strategy isn't what you say, strategy is what you do. Next, and it's helpful that one of these words is absolutely enormous behind me here. I want to talk about the leadership mindsets. And as I said, we were fortunate enough to spend time with a good selection of the leaders of these companies. And there are really 4 leadership behaviors or mindsets I want to share with you today, which I think are an important piece of this journey as well. The first is the courage to choose. They make a decision because the data is never clear. Data always lags. You've got to make that strategic choice before the data has proven it. And the forces of disruption and the trends, then they're also opaque. It's not clear yet, but they've had the courage to choose to enter a new market because it makes strategic sense for their growth story. The example here is from the John Gusick interview, and he said, as they get bigger, companies become more fearful of losing their success, which in turn obviously makes them more conservative and fearful of losing it. But we've tried to do the opposite, which I think was a really interesting point of view. The second is the clarity to focus. And this is not just about focusing on maximizing your core business today, and of course you've got to do that, but it's also focusing on a future point, what we call a future back approach, where you say, what is our view of the world in 10 years? What is the customer going to want in 10 years? Or what is going to be available to solve in terms of how we solve problems in 10 years? What do we have to do today to prepare for that? Even if it's just seeding those early experiments and learning in the market, but at least they have the ability to focus both on today and on a future point of time. The quote there, sorry, I'll go back one, is from Trevor Croker, who's the CEO of Aristocrat. And to be clear, Aristocrat came out of the global financial crisis in a pretty bad way, given the decrease of spending in casinos, and therefore the impact on their gaming machine business. But they used that to say, we've got to make some choices, we've got to cut all distractions, get out of markets that don't make sense, so that we can ultimately double down and win in the most promising opportunities, which for them was social and digital gaming, not the pokie machines or the slot machines that they were manufacturing until that point. The third, curiosity, to explore. And this, as I said, it's been a theme throughout today, but it's that disciplined experimentation. As Darren told us, it cannot be a huge portfolio of things, but a really focused portfolio of experiments around problems that we think our customer or a different customer we can uniquely solve. And then when the evidence becomes clearer and you learn, doubling down through acquisitions, etc. So the curiosity to explore. And the quote here is from Henry Ruiz again at REA Group. And he said, "We never stand still. We have a growth mindset. We're always open to finding data that indicates we could improve or change, which helps us better serve our customers." So it's sort of an everyday mindset, this curiosity. And I actually saw that during my trip to REA. The whole place is organized around agile teams, having their daily scrums and all that. But they really are obsessed about the data and how they can tweak the platform every day to improve the customer experience. And the fourth C here is the conviction to persevere. This is really hard stuff, to both be a leader who maximizes today and creates tomorrow at the same time. They're very different mindsets, very different games that you're playing. So it's going to be difficult. There's going to be crises and challenges along the way, but they maintain their conviction and they persevere. They understand that they've got an A business that needs to do what A does and B does what B does, and they actively manage and arbitrate those resources and assets in the capabilities linked between them. And the quote here is from Andrew Bassett, who's the co-founder and CEO of Seek. And he told us, when we asked him this question about having conviction, he said that, you need to have a board who are willing to take risks and, of course, thoughtful risks. And the example he gave us, which is a really interesting one, is his board sanctioned Seek to enter China before the Australia business was even profitable. They just had that conviction that it was the right thing to do. So courage to choose, clarity to focus, curiosity to explore, and the conviction to persevere. The conclusion that we came to from this study of Australia, or the ASX 200, and companies who've driven outsized performance through dual transformation, the first is really to start today. We're firm believers that you should start your transformation journeys when times are good, when there is resources available, when there is leadership mindsets or capacity to handle all the twists and turns that this journey throws at you. And I think the other thing is just this application of a growth mindset to always think about, absolutely, yes, we have to maximize today. Don't get me wrong. Your A business, transformation A, that pays the bills, that keeps everyone employed. That's the business that we're in. But at the same time, having that growth mindset to look for those opportunities, whether they're nascent or not, and saying, hey, could that also be a business for us? And then exploring it with discipline and ultimately making that strategic choice if it makes sense. So those are the takeaways that we had. And if you do that, you're ultimately going back to Clay at the beginning and his theory of disruption and the innovator's dilemma. You kind of flipped it into the innovator's opportunity, where you're using your assets and your capabilities to go and find other fights that you can fight in and win. So that was the conclusion from the report, but I am very aware that there was no banks on that list, and this was interesting to us as well. We looked at this and we thought, where are the big four banks? And in terms of pure financials, NAB's actually had a pretty average record over the time period we looked at, which was 2010 to 18 on revenues and 14 to 18 on total shareholder returns. NAB, pretty average, but ANZ, Westpac, and Commonwealth actually, between 6 to 8% revenue CAGR in that time, which is pretty reasonable. But I think the point is that this economy has gone gangbusters in that time, and so doing 6 to 8% in an economy like Australia has enjoyed is reasonable. It's not exceptional, I think, is one point. I think the other point that we looked at is they've done a huge amount of digital transformation, of course, so a lot of transformation some of it incremental, some of it more transformational and step change. And that makes a lot of sense, but that's still perpetuating being a bank and doing all the things that a bank does. We couldn't find any meaningful examples. Obviously, they are doing some things around data, of creation of new businesses. And so that was another reason. I think another thing that I think about is oligopolies and the level of comfort that creates and conservatism. I think the Royal Commission, which came up earlier, has probably been a distraction and has probably exacerbated that conservatism. So that's kind of my point of view. You know, if anyone has a different point of view, I'd love to hear about it. I come here a lot, but I don't live here. So you guys are definitely the experts on Australian banking. But that's sort of my take on why they're not in the list. But if we stick on banking and financial services, as I said, this is the full list of 20 that came out a couple of weeks ago in our global, so this is now our 2019 version. You'll see that Netflix and Amazon are still there in the top 3 now with Adobe. But if we look at financial services, the first 3 that stand out, Tencent, Alibaba, and Ping An, and they've come up today as well. These are Chinese tech giants using fintech-enabled models to bring more accessible, more affordable, simpler financial products to the Chinese consumer. And I think that it's interesting to look at it, but it's not as instructive as it could be for a market like Australia, because I think the Chinese consumer is more open to non-traditional ways of banking. So the company I want to talk about, and today has been great for me because almost every speaker has teed up something in my speech, whether it's Clay, the S&P research we do, and next it's going to be number 10 on this list, DBS Group in my home country of Singapore. Because DBS is a very ordinary bank doing very extraordinary things. So I think they are a more interesting case study. And we're fortunate enough to have played a small part of their journey. So I have some things I can share with you. So DBS stands for the Development Bank of Singapore. It's originally part of the government arm, or it was an arm of the government. It spun out as a private company. In 2009, Piyush Gupta joins from Citi and sets out his transformation agenda. One of the first people he hires is Paul Cobban from Standard Chartered, who's their Chief Data and Transformation Officer. Some of you may have come across Paul. He's the person that we've worked most closely with. And he tells this story about his first, it's either for his interview or his first day, I can't remember, but he gets in a taxi and he says, "Take me to DBS." And the taxi driver says, "DBS, damn bloody slow." And it was right, because in 2009, they had the worst customer satisfaction scores in Singapore. Today they have the best. And they're widely acknowledged today as the best bank in the world. And let me tell you just 3 things that they've done, or the 3 major things. They've done many things underneath these 3 to get to where they are today. The first is they said, we need to stop thinking of ourselves as a bank. We need to start thinking about ourselves as a tech company. And the way that they did this is they said, we need to be the Dean Gandalf, so obviously Google, Amazon, Netflix, DBS, Apple, LinkedIn, Facebook. And it might look gimmicky, but they made some huge strategic moves off the back of this reframing of their business. One of which was, historically, they'd outsourced most of their technology. They brought it all back in-house because they said, if we are going to be a tech-driven financial services company, we need to own, design, and operate that technology and minimize operations as much as we can. And once you've done that, and they called it digital to the core, which Darren mentioned earlier, it allows them to build digital-only banks in Indonesia and India and some of the other things that they've done. The next thing they did is drive human-centered design throughout the business. And they think they've saved over 250 million customer hours to date. And that's one of their key metrics, is to reduce the number of hours a customer has to spend interacting with them. Their whole sort of ethos is to make banking joyful, is to make banking invisible. So that's the second thing, human-centered design, to rework all of the sort of customer-facing processes and internal processes. And the third is a huge culture change effort, which is the piece that we've been involved in. With Piyush originally said we need to be a 22,000-person startup. Today it's 27,000-person startup because of their growth. And there's a lot of work that went behind, well, what does that actually mean? What does it mean to be a 27,000-person startup? What are the behaviors? What are the blockers behind those behaviors? What are the behavioral enablers, artifacts, and nudges that we're going to create to drive culture change at scale? And the result of this effort by DBS is that they are the first bank ever to hold these 3 awards at the same time, recognizing them as the best bank in the world. In terms of, this is very much a Transformation A story as well, I do recognize that, but in terms of Transformation B, they have created at least what they say, is the world's largest banking API. They launched it with 155 APIs or partners, and they've basically moved from being a financial services company to an enabler of multiple services. So there's DBS marketplaces that allows you to buy energy services and travel and all these other things. So that's what they've been doing in terms of their transformation story. So where do you guys start, right? And I'm not going to read all of these out, but when you go back to your leadership teams or later this week or early next week, there are some really hard questions that need answers. What are the biggest disruptive threats to our business? What are we doing about it? Do we need to reposition? What is that sustainable problem we're going to solve going forwards? What are the most promising growth opportunities that we face? Are we doing enough to diligently explore those spaces and learn? If we do go into those spaces, what business will we become as a result of it? Who will our competition be? What will that mean for our identity? What are the organizational barriers that will get in our way? Lots of questions, and they are hard questions, and there's a reason for that, because it really is our belief that the reason these are tough questions is because this is the ultimate leadership challenge. We think this is the hardest problem in business today, that of constantly optimizing and reinventing today while simultaneously creating tomorrow. But at the same time, I hope in this talk today I've shown you from the 8 Australian transformation champions in DBS Bank that if you get it right, it's also the greatest opportunity in business today. And if you want to learn more, the report is on the right. You can download that off our website. That's the Australian Champions Report. If you really want to learn more, there's also a book on dual transformation, which you can, I'm sure, find in all good bookstores in Australia. I didn't write it, so I'm not going to plug it as hard as Anthony did. Thank you very much for your time. No costs.